Hey there, welcome to Blockhead, the Peanuts tribute podcast from a cartoonist's point of view. My name is Jeff Grogan, and I will be your host for the next few minutes to talk about Peanuts, Charles Schulz, and all things Charlie Brown, Linus, Lucy, and Snoopy too. So sit back and enjoy. Welcome, Blockhead listeners, to a new episode. Today we have, as promised, John Rose of that bodacious comic strip Barney Google and Snuffy Smith, here to talk about everything Hootin Holler. Really going to enjoy this one. We take a walk through comic strip history a little bit. Snuffy Smith, Barney Google's 100 years old, actually 101 years old this year. They celebrated their 100th anniversary last year with a wonderful celebration, which brought Barney Google to Hootin Holler again. And we talk a little bit about that. We talk a lot about Fred Laswell, John's predecessor on Barney Google and Snuffy Smith, the man who more or less invented Snuffy and all of the characters that inhabit Hootin Holler. Fred Laswell started working for Billy DeBeck in 1934 as his assistant on Barney Google. And that was the year they introduced Snuffy Smith. From what John tells me and from what I've read, Billy DeBeck wanted somebody who came from Appalachia or the mountains or hillbilly country as it was known then. And in fact, Fred Laswell was that man. And so he came on board, and Billy DeBeck unfortunately passed away in 1942. And Fred Laswell picked up the strip and took it all the way to 2001. So this episode is a bit of a walk through comic strip history with John as a guide. And of course, we also talk about John's career, his beginnings as an editorial cartoonist and creative director, and his eventual move into comics and taking over Barney Google and Snuffy Smith from the great Fred Laswell. Some big shoes to fill, but John fills them admirably indeed. And so, without further ado, let's get right to it. John Rose of Snuffy Smith and myself in conversation. Hello, John Rose. Welcome to Blockhead.
Oh, thank you very much, Jeff. Hello to you, and it's an honor for me to be on your podcast. I've listened to many of them, so I feel like I already know you.
Oh man, I'm chuffed, as they say. That you listen to I think you mentioned in an email that you listen to them while you work, and that's like, wow, that's like the greatest compliment.
Yeah, especially when I'm inking. I like to listen to podcasts when I'm inking.
Oh yeah, right. Because inking is a different mindset, right, than writing and drawing. You know, there's something very relaxing, and you can get into that. It's like painting. Inking is very much like painting in the way it feels. You get into this kind of meditative mindset, I think, and you just let the brush kind of flow, you know. So are you working old school then? Or do you put the ink down on paper?
For the most part, yes. I do all the drawing and inking by hand. I did create a font for myself, and that's really based on the fact that when I was an assistant to Fred Laswell, he had a font. He was probably one of the first cartoonists to ever have a font. Wow. So I do have a font that I use for most of my lettering, and then I do scan my artwork in the computer, and I'll make some minor adjustments there, or reduce it and add copyright symbols and things like that. But I do scan it and email it. But for the most part, I do everything traditionally.
Uh-huh. It's interesting to hear you say that Fred Laswell had a font. I mean, it's nothing for you and me to have fonts nowadays, and cartoonists do it all the time. But to hear Fred Laswell had a font, I mean, my gosh, he'd been doing the comics since 1942, right? And
right.
And then didn't retire till 2001. So, that whole idea is new to cartoonists who are our generation, never mind Fred Laswell. So that's amazing.
Right. Yeah, that was I don't know exactly the year that he created it, but I started working for him in 1998 as his inking assistant, and he had the font at that time.
Wow.
So
Okay.
that was a long time ago.
Yeah, that is a long time ago, and it's really interesting that he was still, even at that point in his career, unafraid of venturing into new territory and new ways of doing things. So, just for folks who are just tuning in, John is the cartoonist and writer, right, of Snuffy Smith and Barney Google. Barney Google and Snuffy Smith, really, is the title.
Right.
You've been doing it since what, 2001?
Right. I started as an assistant to Fred in 1998, and then when he passed away in March of 2001, that's when I began my tenure as a cartoonist on Barney Google and Snuffy Smith.
So Fred Laswell was working on Snuffy Smith right up until he passed away.
Exactly. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Gosh, that's unbelievable. Before we get into your whole story, tell us a little bit about Fred Laswell. I mean, my gosh, that man, it was a walking history of comics.
He was. I mean, he was such a creative genius, and not only was he just a cartoonist, but he was also an inventor of products. He had been an assistant to Billy DeBeck, the cartoonist who created the Barney Google strip in 1919, and he had done so many other things. He had a line of children's videos and a DVD that he created. So he was really somebody that was ahead of his time, especially when it came to technology.
Well, and very creative too, because he came, if I understand correctly, he came up with the character of Snuffy Smith, right? It was his addition to the strip.
Right. He started in the working as an assistant to DeBeck in the year that they brought on Snuffy Smith, when they added him as a character in the 30s. And he really was the one that, when DeBeck passed away and Fred inherited the strip, he was really the one that then developed the character of Snuffy Smith into the and the strip itself into the strip that it became, with the focus kind of shifting from Barney Google to Snuffy Smith and the mountains of Hootin Holler in that community.
Right. And it's kind of it was a big swing, but in a lot of ways, I mean, really, Fred Laswell is the person who defined then the Snuffy Smith strip, as it were.
Sure.
I mean, it's really his vision that not so much Billy DeBeck, who was really focused primarily on Barney Google and Sparkplug and the world of racing and all of that.
Right.
Fred Laswell had a different set of interests. Was Fred Laswell from, or did he have experience with Appalachia and the hillbilly country and all of that kind of thing, or was it just purely from his imagination?
Well, I think he lived in, I think he would say, the foothills of Missouri when he
Okay.
was younger, and he was he had creative phrases. I think he kind of called himself a hayseed, but he really wasn't. But he then also lived in Tampa, and the way he actually came to work for Billy DeBeck, he was working. He was just 17 years old, and he had created a poster, which I believe was for like the Chamber of Commerce event. And Billy DeBeck was in town playing golf and happened to see this poster and really liked the artwork on the poster, and got in touch with Fred and actually interviewed Fred about being his assistant, and then asked Fred if he had any lettering, that he was really looking for somebody to do some lettering. And at that point, I think in the samples, Fred didn't have a whole lot of lettering. So we went home, worked through the night, showed Billy some of his lettering the next day. Billy really liked it, hired him as his assistant. And Fred even besides just being an assistant to the cartoonist, he lived with them, he traveled with him, and Billy kind of got an interest there in the 30s with the hillbilly culture in Appalachia, and that was the same year that Fred came onto the strip. So Fred accompanied him, and they went on a journey up into the Appalachian Mountains, taking notes and making sketches, and so that's kind of how that all began.
Wow. So I wonder what it was that spurred Billy DeBeck into thinking about hillbilly country and Appalachia and the mountains and all of that. I know in that era there was. It's kind of interesting from a sociological perspective, I suppose. In that particular era, Depression era, just out of the Depression era, there's kind of an interest in that world. Little Abner focused on that kind of world, and I think there were other cultural artifacts that come from that period that were sort of focused on the world, that hillbilly world, whether it was to lampoon it or whatnot. Maybe it had something to do with industrialization and, growing divide between the areas. But I wonder what it was that drew Billy DeBeck to that culture as a subject matter. It strikes me as kind of odd after what he'd been doing with Barney Google all those years.
Yeah, I don't know what developed his fascination. I don't know if he could see the future, that maybe that was going to be something that people would really be interested in. I'm not sure, but he did start to have a fascination with Appalachia, and that's kind of where it all started.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because Barney Google was one of the most popular characters of the 20s. Popular music, popular songs about Barney Google with the googly eyes and all of that stuff. It's kind of interesting. It reminds me, sort of in a way, I don't know, it'd be like Elsie Seeger putting away Popeye and moving on to another character, or maybe in a sense, it's like Elsie Seeger dropping, what was Olive Oil's brother's name? Oh gosh, but Castor Oil, yeah, that figures. Yeah, leaving Castor Oil, because Castor Oil had been the star of the strip, and then he moved on to Popeye, and I guess that's kind of what happened with Barney Google.
Right? Yeah, I guess that's what happened, and all I could think is maybe he felt. I think at the time, maybe Barney Google had sort of reached the height of his fame, maybe the height of his early fame with Barney and Sparkplug, and I think it was, maybe starting to wane a bit and go down. So maybe he saw this avenue as another way to make the strip resurge again.
Sure. Yeah, new characters, new blood, new point of view. And then, for all these years now, I mean, how many years? Wow, since 1942, and Snuffy came along a little bit before that. Wow, that's a long, long time. And obviously it worked.
Right.
It worked. And Snuffy is still popular today. And so I want to get back to Fred Laswell for a minute, but like, what do you think is the underlying reason for Snuffy's continued popularity? What is it you think he represents to people, and Hootin Holler and that culture? What do you think that why does its appeal continue over 70, 80 years?
To me, I think that the real appeal, the true appeal of this comic strip, probably as well as any successful comic strip, is I think it lies in the characters, and of course almost all these characters were created before me, so I can't take any credit for that, but I can try my best to stay true to the character. And to me, that's the secret. It's a comfortable set of characters that people enjoy spending time with every day. They want to check in with every day. Maybe it's a flashback to a simpler time when your days get hectic or something. It's a look back a little bit. But I would say, all in all, to me, it's the characters that inhabit the strip that make people really enjoy the comic.
At one point, it was well over 1,000 papers. It's still doing well. It's still, I mean, it's always been in my local paper here, and it seems to be pretty much everywhere I pick up a newspaper that's got a comics section, I
Yeah,
see.
it's still very successful in hundreds of papers and online clients around the world, which is it's pretty amazing. Um, it's actually, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's very popular in the country of Norway, um, and I actually do a special Christmas comic book every it comes out every November. It's not really Christmas themed, but the cover is Christmas themed
Uh-huh.
for the country of Norway. Don't ask me how Snuffy says bodacious in Norwegian or anything, but it's very popular there as well as in lots of other countries, and it's just a blessing to get to be a part of it.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, what it means to Norwegians, I don't know, but
Yeah, I
it's
don't know, but it's essentially what they do is every year. I think it's in November. I actually just finished this year's cover, but I create a new cover for the comic strip, and I mean for the comic book, and it has a Christmas theme usually on the cover, and then the inside is all reprints in color of Barney Google and Snuffy Smith Sunday pages.
okay.
Um, so it's a neat little book that they do each year.
Well, it's interesting. I know also that speaking of strips that are popular overseas, I have there's a friend of mine on Instagram, Henrik Rare, who did some work for a paper that I published a couple years ago and is a very successful illustrator. Does Beetle Bailey illustrations for a Beetle Bailey magazine that's published in Sweden,
Right.
and it seems to be very popular there,
hmm I
which is
agree. I've heard, yeah, Beetle Bailey's very popular there.
It's isn't that interesting?
It
So
is.
what the appeal is to different cultures, why one character resonates. Snoopy is huge in Tokyo. There's a
hmm
Snoopy museum that just opened up in Tokyo,
Right.
and
I saw that on Instagram.
right, yeah, and so there, Snuffy is in Norway, and Beetle Bailey is in Sweden, and who the heck knows why?
I
But
know.
whatever, it's great. It's
That's
because
right. I'm just thankful we should all be thankful that they are. So that's really neat.
Well, in the United States, we tend to think that we're the world. You get this myopic view of the world. It's only when you travel abroad that you realize different cultures have different points of view that are equally valid,
hmm Right.
And I mean, and so what we may not celebrate here in Snuffy Smith. Maybe a comic book wouldn't fly here, but over there it flies because there's something of enduring appeal that really reaches that audience. And maybe you're right too. It has something to do with a simpler time because all of the craziness that surrounds us and the idea of characters that live in a world that seems without time and
True.
sometime previous to our own, but a world that seems remote, untouched by
hmm
COVID or untouched by politics, untouched by all of the tribulations of the modern world. It's an
Right.
escape in a way, um,
hmm
and I think that's part of what the appeal is for Snuffy. Let's talk a little bit more about Fred Laswell because you must have gotten to know him fairly well over the course of time that you worked with him. I mean, like I said, he was a walking history in a lot of ways of the comic strip world. He lived through it all pretty much, and outlived Charles Schultz and was working right up to the end. Right, and so did Fred Laswell write the strips as well as draw them?
Yes. He did. Uh, well, I'll start. The way I came to work for Fred,
Mhm.
um, as his assistant, I uh, I was at a meeting of the National Cartoonist Society. This was in 1998, and I was talking with a friend who was working. He was an editorial cartoonist, but he was also working as an assistant on the Blondie comic strip. And I really didn't know at that point that a lot of comic strip cartoonists used assistants. And I thought maybe this would be a neat way. I've always wanted to work on a comic strip, and that was always my lifelong dream.
Hmm.
And I thought maybe this would be an opportunity I could try to explore. So on the, I was, it was a Rubens weekend, and on our way home, I talked to my wife about, what I'd heard and talking with my friend that was working on Blondie, and I thought about it, and really the first comic strip I thought of was Snuffy Smith. I'd grown up reading it. It was my grandfather's favorite comic strip. It was one that would, I don't know, like you said, everywhere you went, you just kind of always saw it. And um, so I kind of worked up some samples. When I got home, I drew some drawings of the characters. I did a sample Sunday comic strip, and then I sent that along with my other work, some other work like some books, some other things to Fred Laswell. And I didn't know Fred, but as a member of the Cartoonist Society, the National Cartoonist Society, I had his address, his mailing address. So I mailed these samples to him. And I guess a couple weeks had gone by. Well, as a cartoonist, you get a lot of rejection. And, Fred, like you said, he was like a legend in our field, one of the luminaries for certain of the time. And so I figured I probably wouldn't hear back from him, or if I did hear back, it would be kind of a thanks but no thanks letter. But it was about 2 weeks later, and I was at home eating lunch. I even remember I was eating a nutritious lunch, a bowl of Cocoa Puffs. And the phone rang. I answered the phone, and the voice on the other end, said, "John, this is Fred Laswell." And I kind of like choked on my Cocoa Puffs. And he said, "I got the packet of samples that you sent me, and I really like the way you draw big noses." Word for word, that's what he said. And he was just so comfortable, talking about it. He was just had a funny way of talking. He was just a funny guy all the way around. And it kind of, I guess, to make a long story short, that call ended up he needed somebody to be his inking assistant. And this is just a cold call. I just had sent those to him out of the blue, and he liked my work. He ended up hiring me to be his inking assistant, and like you said, he wrote the strip, and then he would write it. He wrote the strip, and then he sketched it out, and then he faxed it to me, and then I would take what he sent me, and then I would take that, then I would ink it, and like I said, he had a font. He had given me his font, so I would ink it, letter it with his font, scan it back into the computer, and email it back to him for if he had corrections. He'd send it back to me on the fax, marked up, correct this, correct that. But then once it was approved, then he would, he approved it and then would send it on to the syndicate in New York City. But he was so much into technology, especially back then. It didn't matter to him that he lived in Florida and I lived in Virginia. The syndicate was in New York City. It didn't bother him. I went down to see him several times during the course of the time that I worked for him, but almost every day I would get phone calls, emails. We talked basically that way, or definitely faxes. Had a lot of faxes.
So when you got a faxed comic, you took it. You didn't use that to work on top of? You lightboxed it or something?
I had he actually got me a copier. I had a copier here. He said that would be something important that I would need. So I would take his sketch that he had faxed or the comic strip he had faxed, and I would enlarge it on the copier. And then I would work from that sketch to then do the inking and then do the lettering.
So you would enlarge it and photocopy it onto just regular old copy paper and draw on top of that, or you
if I needed to make, most of the time I would ink, just draw it on Bristol board after I enlarged. Then I would draw what he had, his rough sketch. I would flesh it out. Sometimes I'd send it back if I had a question, or he'd send it back to me if something was incorrect. He was funny. If he really liked it, he'd say something like, this is fine as a frog's hair, or if I made a mistake, he'd say like, have you been looking out the window again, or stop looking out the window, um, pay attention to this or that, and
Hmm.
so
What
he was a great teacher. He was a really good friend to me, and a great teacher.
couple of thoughts come to mind simultaneously. One is that I've spoken to a couple of folks the last couple of weeks, Marcus Hamilton and Ron Ferdinand from Dennis the Menace. Both
Great guys, yeah.
they are great guys, really, really nice, and both of whom took a shot in the dark. And I have to say, it really restores your faith when you hear stories like yours and like theirs, where you just took a shot in the dark. You did some drawings, you sent them off, and lo and behold, you got a response. And
Right.
how often does it? Now the reality is that doesn't happen very often, but it can happen, and the
Right.
fact that it can happen should offer some solace and hope to all of us who struggle in anonymity and hope to score a big hit or a comic strip someday. You just never know. And you don't.
I mean, I guess I always figured. I mean, I submitted my own comic strips too to to syndicates over time, and I just always figured. I guess the worst thing they can do is say no, and
Yeah,
then I just move on from that.
yeah, and that's what you do. You have to move on from it and not let it thwart you in any way, because it's just part of everyday life. And it
Right.
but the only way to succeed is not only to be trained and have the tools and ready to go, but to keep trying, keep swinging at the. I hate to do the baseball analogy, but keep stepping up to the plate, right? You got to keep doing.
Right.
And
Exactly.
you guys are absolute proof that it works out. What kinds of things would Fred Lasswell, find that were problematic in what you were doing? I mean, what kinds of uh, little things bothered him?
Well, of course, getting the characters to look exactly right. I remember one time, he said, like, I've noticed over the last week, you've been drawing Loweezy's nose a little bit too big. You know, I might be the only one that notices that, but we need to, let's correct it now. So
Mhm.
I'd work on that. I remember the socks, like Snuffy socks, the little stripes in his socks, having to leave them. At first I didn't know. I filled them in all the time, and he's like, no, we've got to leave them open, leave them white on Sundays because we need to color them in
Mhm.
red. Um, so it was usually little things. There were times if I made a mistake, he'd let me know that I'd made a mistake, but he was always fine the next day.
Mhm.
He just had a really great personality.
So it was mostly just about making sure the proportions were correct and the character stayed on model, as we say in anime,
Right.
right?
Especially the faces and the hands.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
those were
Because
really important.
he had a very distinct way of drawing faces and noses. That's for sure.
Hmm.
The noses for Snuffy Smith are all pretty much unique to Snuffy. And
Right. Just kind of mostly all are just big, bulbous type noses.
they
You know.
they certainly are. I think it's a surprise not one of them's had a nose job, but
Yeah, that's right.
I think
I
if
have
I
to write that down as an idea for the future.
yeah, right. Yeah, Wheezy goes for a nose job. That would be something. But anyway, did you ever get into talking about his early years with Billy DeBeck, or any of working with Billy DeBeck, or other cartoonists, or the world of cartooning, or working far apart like you did most of the time, just didn't really offer the opportunity?
We didn't talk a whole lot. We did talk some on some of the times that I would go down there. Um, I remember, uh, he would say, well, he told me, like I said, that he, lived with Billy and traveled a lot with Billy, wherever he went. I do remember him saying that Billy DeBeck would kind of sketch out, just kind of do like a rough sketch uh, of the strip, and then just kind of jump right into it with inking, and um, I don't know. I'm not that way at all. So to me, that kind of, that really surprised me. I have to really, think it out and get it drawn out pretty well before I get into my inking and everything. Although I do use a lot of whiteouts. To me, that's a very important tool.
Oh, there are areas where you feel like you've overdrawn or over inked something, and you just want to
Right.
clean it up. Yeah, well, and I mean, one of the things about Snuffy Smith is absolutely, pristine in terms of the line work and the use of black and white. I mean, it's very, very clear.
It does have a very unique. I agree with you, especially the black and white. I think it helps it really stand out on the page.
Oh, absolutely.
Between Billy and Fred, the way they used the negative space and the positive space was pretty incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it's very well designed and very strong in black and white. And I'm looking at your book, Snuffy Smith and his Sunday Best here,
Well,
and
thank you.
and it pops. I mean, the black and white really pops on the page here. It really looks good. And, that has to do with the, intelligent use of black and white and positive and negative space. And boy, it sure does it really well, because these really sing off the page.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I appreciate you taking the time to look at it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, sure. It's, it's a lot of fun, and continues to be fun. I mean, the characters are a lot of fun, and I think that's one of the reasons now that for its longevity. So you're writing the strip as well as drawing it, and penciling it, and you're doing the whole ball of wax yourself.
Yes, I have had over the years, over the 20 years, I guess, I've had two other people help me with the writing. One has since retired, and one still sends gags. So I do all the drawing, some of the writing, and basically that's kind of how it works. I do have one person that submits ideas.
Sure. Every now and again, you find you're dry that day and you need an idea, and it's good to have a reservoir. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, particularly when you're continuing a strip and it's, a legacy strip. And I think that it just makes a lot of sense, because particularly kind of gags that are, in some sense, like, it's rare that the narrative moves forward. In these strips like Dennis and your strip, the world is sort of set and things don't change. So if things aren't changing, it's really, I would find that really hard to write for any length of time.
I kind of think of it, I guess I kind of think of the comic strip, it's in its own, I guess if this makes any sense, it's in its own space, but it's in our time. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I try to think of it. For example, the characters may comment on something in general, like a recession or something like that, but they're never going to get real specific with our time. That's kind of the way I think about it when I try to.
Yeah, they sort of exist in a snow globe kind of thing.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and so within the snow globe, there's a certain set of rules by which the universe works. And so you don't mess with those rules. And every now and again, there's a reflection of something that is seen from the outside world, but it's really no more than that.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great description. I like that.
Well, so in that way, you can sort of touch upon things, but never really say anything or do anything that sort of puts it out of sync with, like, any other time. So we can go back. We're reading the book you put out in 2018, Snuffy Smith and his Sunday Best. Back and read that, and it's not out of sync with today, because the world of Snuffy just doesn't change.
True.
And that's like it is for a lot of comic strips, for Hagar the Horrible, or for Dennis the Menace, or whatnot. That's the goal, in a way. Mm-hmm. Create that kind of universality.
I agree.
Always relatable. Yeah. So, John, tell us a little bit then about what it felt like to take over that strip when Fred Laswell passed away. I mean, you'd been training for it, but all of a sudden, it was all yours.
It was basically kind of, I guess, the way it all happened. After Fred passed away, Jay Kennedy, who was a great editor at King Features, he contacted me, and he offered me an audition, and I didn't know at the time. He just said he'd like me, would I like to try out to do the comic strip? And I said sure. And I didn't know at the time that he was also auditioning other people too.
Oh.
But I did my samples that he had, he asked me to send him a certain amount of work, and I did, and he liked it, and he said, so I was on cloud nine that he liked it, and then he said I'm also auditioning a couple other people, but he said I'll get back to you next week, and we were actually going on a family vacation that week, and this was 2001. I didn't have a cell phone or anything then, so I told him I'd be out of town, and he said, well, just check in with me from time to time next week. So we went to Myrtle Beach in South Carolina, and basically anytime we went anywhere throughout the day, I'm running from like payphone to payphone to call the office just to check in, because this was like what I really wanted. I guess it'd been my dream ever for as long as I could remember, and so I spent a lot of time at payphones that week of vacation. But then near the end of the week, I think it was a Thursday, he finally, I got a hold of him, and it was actually back at our place, and back at the house we were staying in for vacation, the condo. And, he said that he really liked my work, and, he actually, I guess the way he described it, he told me that I had a very friendly line for the characters. I guess he liked my inking line, or the way I drew the characters. And he said he'd like to hire me to continue the comic strip on. And then, like you said, then it was just, I was really excited, that night. But then, the next morning you wake up and you're like, wow, these are such big shoes to fill. But from the time, they hired me, and I've always had the support of, initially Jay Kennedy, and then the other editors after him. Everybody's been great to work for, great to work with. And it was overwhelming at first, but it also, I also felt like a sense of not duty, but a sense that I really wanted to carry on, what I had learned from Fred, and keep the comic strip consistent with what it had been in the past, and so we could maintain our fans. And so it was overwhelming, but it was also, the biggest, the greatest joy of my professional life for sure.
And it has remained remarkably consistent, I think, over the years.
Thank you.
Did Fred leave any instructions for Jay Kennedy or for King? Did he say anything to them about, look, John's been working on the strip for these few years here, and I think he'd be a great guy to take over the strip? Do you know if there was any?
I don't know. I don't know if he ever said that. I don't know that. I know, the people at King Features knew that I had been assisting, but I guess they also knew other people that must have been interested too, because, like I said, other people had auditioned as well. But yeah, I don't know. That'd be great if Fred said that, but I don't know if he did. But
did you? I'm reminded of the Prince Valiant story, right, where Hal Foster tried out a number of artists before he decided on John Cullen Murphy. And every now and again, if you go online, you get to see, some of those tryout runs, like by Wally Wood or some of the other folks who tried out. I can't remember who else tried out for it. But I've seen Wally Wood's, and I love Wally Wood stuff. But boy, I just felt like Wally Wood wasn't the right guy. And when you look at John Cullen Murphy's stuff, he's the guy that Foster's going to choose when you look at those samples. I think in one of my Prince Valiant collections, as a matter of fact, I got to go back and look now. There's a selection. So I wonder who else tried out for Snuffy Smith and what their work looked like.
Yep. I really have no idea.
Yeah,
You
because
mentioned
you've
that
seen them. Hmm.
Cullen. Have you ever read Cullen Murphy's book, Cartoon County?
Oh my gosh, I love
Talking
that
about
book.
all the cartoonists around. What is
Yes.
that? Fairfield County in Connecticut.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you
Oh,
read?
that's a great book.
Isn't that a great book?
Yeah,
It's a
it's
real
wonderful.
joy. And actually, I wanted to get his son on the show. I wanted to get Cullen Murphy on the show to talk about it, but he's an editor at the Atlantic, and he's just too busy. Uh,
Okay.
it would have been great because I loved that book. I just loved
Hmm.
it. It was sweet, nostalgic. It was filled with lots of great detail. And I got to tell you, when I looked at the samples or the sketches that Hal Foster did for John Cohen Murphy in preparation for doing, this week or the next week or whatever, until he finally gave it up. Those sketches he did could you believe those? They were almost as detailed as the final illustrations.
Oh yeah, you're right. Hmm.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
he just kept going. But that's one of my all-time favorite comic strips. But that was just a great book. And for those of you who've never picked it up out there in listener land, Cartoon County by Cullen Murphy is a wonderful, wonderful book. And if you love,
I did have the pleasure actually. Trying to think if it was a year or two ago. Thomas Yates, who's drawing Prince Valiant now,
uh-huh,
actually came to speak at a college nearby me here in Virginia, and one of the people actually, one of the professors that brought him in, asked me if I would come speak as well. So I do a lot of like Snuffy Smith chalk talks, I guess is what I call them, and so I did mine, and then when I was finished, he did his, and it was wonderful just to hear all about Prince Valiant and the history, and then see his work and everything. I really enjoyed it.
yeah, it's quite. I'm sure it was quite interesting. The history, and Fantagraphics is just doing such a wonderful job with that line of reprints. It's just magnificent. I
Mm-hmm.
wish they were bigger, like the old comic strip pages, but that's okay. They're still beautiful, and it's
Right.
so nice to see. I mean, among reprints of comic strips, they're among the best that I've got in my collection that I've ever seen. They're just so lushly illustrated and so lovingly recreated on the page in those books. So that's pretty cool. Before you started working with Fred Laswell and on Snuffy Smith and Barney Google, you had a career of your own as an editorial cartoonist, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
That's true.
So
Yeah.
so tell us a little bit about that work and your, the trajectory that led you into comics and cartooning and doing that kind of work.
You want me to go all the way back to the beginning?
Hey, why not? Sure, we got
Yeah,
time.
I can do that. Um, I don't remember this, but my parents say when I was very very young, we were traveling somewhere, and I asked my mom if she would draw something for me, and she said, "What do you want me to draw?" And I asked her to if she would draw a man, and she drew a little stick figure and handed it back to me, and I said, "That's not a man." And she said, "Well, draw your own." And she said I did, and I've just been drawing ever since. Um, so that's kind of how I guess it all started. I I then went on to, I guess I was always drawing, and when I was in fifth grade, well, let's see, I'll tell these two stories because I know you're a teacher, and this shows two instances where I think teachers were really important in my life. When I was in fifth grade, it was a rainy weekend, and I told my parents I was going to go upstairs in my room and write a book. And I'm sure they were just happy to get me out of their hair for the weekend. So they said, go ahead. And I went up anyway. I wrote this book, and it was called Casey the Canine. And I guess my parents must have liked it because they actually told my fifth grade teacher about it. And she told the principal at the school about it. And I guess they liked it. I wrote and illustrated it. And they decided that the school would publish the book.
Wow.
And like this was in the days, I'm 50, almost 57. These were in the days of mimeograph machines.
Sure.
I don't know if you remember what that is, but
Of course I do. I'm a little older than you.
I don't know if the book read very well, but it smelled great.
Yeah.
Incidentally, on the cover, I should send you a picture of the cover. The dog looks so much like a fifth grader's interpretation of Snoopy. But anyway, so the teacher and the principal published the book, and they arranged for me to have a book signing after a PTA meeting in the school library.
Oh my gosh.
And then from that event, I made enough money that night to pay for my way to go to Boy Scout camp that summer.
Pretty good.
And which was, I guess it's technically my first paying job as a cartoonist.
I guess so.
More importantly, I think it shows the importance of, if your parents believe in you, if your teacher believes in you, it kind of makes you think, hey, maybe someday I really can be a cartoonist. And then the second event was that ties into a teacher believing in me. When I was after I graduated, like all through school, I drew for the school papers and drew in the margins of my test papers and stuff like that, like every other cartoonist. But I went to James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And when I was, I think I was a junior or senior in college. I think I was a junior. My art history professor was on a fine arts committee at JMU that was bringing in Mike Peters, the Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist, to speak. And this was right at the time he was launching his successful Mother Goose and Grimm comic strip.
Sure.
And she told me it was called Fine Arts Week. I think that's what the event was. And he was the keynote speaker. So anyway, she met with me after class one day and told me that, she knew that I drew cartoons for the school paper and I always wanted to be a cartoonist. And so she asked me if I'd like to join the members of the committee and Mike Peters for dinner before he spoke, so I could grill him about being a cartoonist. And he was so I got to go out to dinner with him and the committee. Then I got to go to his program, which was just amazing and really inspirational. And then after that, I got to show him a lot of my samples and have him critique them. And, and all this again was just because of a teacher that, took an interest in me. So I think being a teacher, I guess in short, I'm saying is such an important job.
Hey listeners, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I hope you're enjoying today's interview. If you are and you want to show support, head on over to my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/Jeff Grogan. At Patreon, you can contribute as little as $1 on a regular basis to ensure the longevity of this podcast. Your support will help keep it not only commercial free, but free to the listening public. And in exchange, you'll get some pretty neat stuff. There are at least 3 different tiers. Each level offers its own distinct rewards. So check it out today at patreon.com/Jeff Grogan, GeoffGrogan. Any amount is welcome, and your support is greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and that's patreon.com/Jeff Grogan.
And anyway, so when I look back that night, I think it was an important turning point for me, maybe as a young cartoonist, because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. But after seeing Mike's presentation and then talking with him, he's a real animated guy and real friendly, real funny. And then, we've stayed in touch, ever since.
Oh, that's great.
And that made me feel like I wanted to go into newspaper cartooning. And so it took me a little while. I graduated from college in 1986, and then I did some freelance work for a couple years, and then I got on with a newspaper chain in 1988, which was Bird newspapers, and I started out at a small paper for them, and I was like a creative director and an editorial cartoonist. And then as that was for about 5 years I worked there at the Warren Sentinel was the name of the newspaper, and then they promoted me to the Daily News Record in Harrisonburg, Virginia. So I worked as an editorial cartoonist and creative director, and pretty much as time went on, my job began to focus more and more on doing editorial cartoons. So I did a lot of editorial cartoons for them, and then it was a great way. I met a lot of other cartoonists through that. I got to meet Jeff McNelly. I joined the National Cartoon Society when I was doing that, and then I still, in 2001, when I started drawing Snuffy full time, I still would part-time send them cartoons, editorial cartoons. But I decided, I wanted Snuffy to be my main focus at that point. But it was, it all worked out, and it was great.
Yeah, it sounds like a seamless transition in a lot of ways. I've never seen your editorial cartoons, so I'd be curious to see what they look like in contrast to the style you adopted for Snuffy Smith, because like a lot of great illustrators, you can move from you've moved from one style to another style. Was there similarities between what you were doing on your own and Snuffy Smith, or did you have to adapt and sort of conform to Fred Laswell's kind of approach?
No, I would say there are similarities, I would think, but they're between the editorial cartoons and Snuffy Smith in style and my style, but it is basically a totally different style. That was probably one of the biggest challenges I had, was learning to draw the Snuffy characters after many years of drawing in my own style. And I probably did everything pretty much with the editorial cartoons. I do everything more in like a brush, and I still use a brush some on Snuffy, but I also use a variety of different type pens, and I use those micron pens.
Yeah,
in different sizes.
Sure.
But so they are different in style. But in my editorial cartoons, I always use humor too. I'm not a real hard hitting. I never really have been a real hard hitting kind of person.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's, editorial cartooning is its own animal. When you worked for the paper, did you have to, usually an editorial page has a point of view, one way or the other. Did you have to adapt, or rather adopt, their point of view, or was it just fortunate that they coincided, or, were you assigned topics, or did you come up with topics on your own?
Pretty much everything I come up with on my own. Mm-hmm. And then most of the time, opinions coincided, probably pretty much, but they never really killed anything. They did kill stuff from time to time, but nothing that bad, I guess, for disagreeing. I just go back to the drawing board and do something else.
And what kind of turnaround time did you have in terms of putting together a cartoon? Was it like, last minute notice, or did you, sometimes I would think it would be, right?
It was right. It was sometimes last minute notice. Usually it's a day to two ahead of time.
But sometimes something would break in the news.
Right.
They'd want something for the next day.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Sure. So you'd have a couple of hours or something to put to.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, the pressure. I can imagine that pressure can be really exciting too, because somebody wants your work and they want it now. That's a great motivator.
Right.
Especially when it's your job. So that's great. So you did that for a number of years before giving it up and moving on to doing Snuffy. Now, Snuffy Smith is this very, very clean. Like I said, the word I used before was pristine, and it really is pristine. And there's despite the fact that you're using micron pens, the line is really beautiful in
Well,
Snuffy.
thank you.
It's really nice, and it holds together. When you were doing editorial cartooning, usually it's a one panel kind of thing, right? And a lot of times, like somebody like McNeely or Mike Peters or others, they get into the illustration and into the, doing the cross hatching and things of that nature. Did you do that kind of thing in your editorial cartoons, or did you kind of leave it clean?
I would say probably a combination, a little bit of both. Probably they were more simple in style for sure than Jeff McNelly, and but I still would use some pretty bold brush strokes and some techniques with the brush. I still do editorial cartoons, still occasionally. Do you know Charlie Daniel? He's an editorial cartoonist in Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
And I know his cartoons are fairly simple, and I would say mine, like in design, on purpose, they're designed that way. And I would say mine were probably designed that way too. But also, because I was also a creative director at the same time, a lot of times I didn't have the time as much time as, like a whole day to really spend on something.
Sure.
So sometimes they had to be simple.
Right. So, but then, that opened up doors by facilitating your acceptance into the National Cartoonist Society, and through the National Cartoonist Society, opportunities came, such as reaching out to Fred. But did you have any opportunities to meet any of your heroes at any of those National Cartoonist meetings?
I did. Probably one of my biggest heroes I've had the opportunity to meet and get to know, besides Mike Peters, I got to know Mort Walker, and then his sons also as well. And that was a real joy to get to know Mort. Of course, I don't know if Marcus mentioned, Marcus Hamilton and I have become great friends, and Ron Ferdinand, and we all met through the National Cartoonist Society. And a person that I'd grown up reading a lot in Virginia, I don't know if you're familiar with Gary Brookins. He was an editorial cartoonist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch in Richmond, Virginia. He's gone on after he stopped editorial cartooning. I think actually even when he was editorial cartooning, he began to draw shoe and pluggers with Jeff McNelly, and then after Jeff McNelly passed away. But he's a great cartoonist and a great friend, and I got to know him. Another one, initially, right when I graduated from college, I got to meet two people that really kind of helped me out too along the way. Brant Parker, the Wizard of Id. It just turned out by chance that one of my really good friends in college, her brother lived next door to Brant Parker. And it was he only lived about 20 minutes from where I lived after I graduated from college.
And where was that?
I lived in Manassas, Virginia, and he was in Centerville, Virginia.
Okay. Yeah.
Kind of all in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Brant was actually the one that nominated me or supported my nomination with a letter, I guess you'd say a recommendation for the National Cartoonist Society membership. But he was such a wonderful man, and he was really busy as a cartoonist. So sometimes when people would contact him, if he was really busy and too busy to do something, he would, send them my way. So that was really nice and really, really sweet of him to do. And I got a few jobs out of that. And again, just by chance, I got to meet, again, it was a friend of mine in college. Her brother was really good friends with Bill Reckon, who did Croc, the comic strip Croc.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, I remember Croc, yep.
And he lived in Northern Virginia, too. So I got to meet him, and I didn't really ever work with Bill, but I got to meet him and became friends with him. As a matter of fact, the last Rubens weekend, the National Cartoonist Society Rubens weekend when Fred Lasswell was alive, he had called me to see if we could get a table together with Bill Reckon, myself, and my wife Karen, and he and his wife Shirley, and then and Bill, and then he told me he was planning to do that, and then actually Fred passed away, but so Bill became a great friend too. So it's kind of neat how things just kind of happen sometimes.
Oh yeah, sure, and it's wonderful, to be admitted into that circle of people and start meeting your idols, and things like that. But it's nice to hear that about Brant Parker. I grew up in this area where Johnny Hart lived for many years.
Right.
Came
Hmm.
from and he was BC, and he worked with Brant Parker a bit. I don't know exactly what he did on the Wizard of Id. Apparently it was Parker and Hart. But what Hart did, that strip, it's never really been clear to me how the division of labor. What was kind of interesting to me, though, was that Brant Parker and Johnny Hart shared a similar cartooning style.
That's true. I agree. Yeah.
Very similar. And it's kind of neat. I loved the way both of them drew, and it's not really easy. There's a quality about it that seems offhand,
Hmm.
very loose, very. It's got this offhand kind of doodly quality to it, but trying to draw like that or cartoon like that, it's subtler than I think a lot of folks think it really is. And I just loved Wizard of Id and BC growing up. I thought they were some of the most clever comic strips in the newspapers.
I did get to meet Johnny Hart. I didn't know him, but I did get to meet him, and that was an honor. I guess that's a regret I have. I never got to meet Charles Schultz. I would have really loved to have gotten to meet him,
Yeah, me
but
too.
yeah.
I would have loved to have met him. And despite the fact that I grew up in the same town and as Johnny Hart, and he was a hometown hero, I never got to meet him either. And a lot of missed opportunities there. I mean, there were moments where I had a friend who had a friend, and I was supposed to meet him, but nothing ever worked out. So I never did get to shake hands with him. But
I
yeah,
did
well,
get to spend back in, guess it was November. We had a National Cartoonist Society, like a regional meeting for the people in the Southeast, and I got to spend some time with Johnny's grandson, Mason,
yeah,
and he's
who's
doing he's doing an awesome job on
on
BC and the Wizard.
yeah.
Really nice guy.
Yeah, and he does both of those strips, and they do a nice job. Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. Sure, and it's great to see that they're still going strong. When we look at Snuffy Smith today, and we think about your contribution, which is, going on 20 years now, that you've been working on the strip on your own. What do you think that your contribution to this strip has been over that 20 years? When you look at your work and you look at Fred's work and you think about the strip, I mean, what do you think? What is it that you've brought to the strip that's uniquely your own?
I don't know. That's a good question. I never really have thought about that. I just I try to stay true to what to Fred's work before me, and then Billy's work before him. But I know over time my style has crept into it, and I'm sure I'm not as adept a draftsman as Fred was, but I try. One thing I have a change that I have made. I have made the characters literate, so they read now where they didn't read before. They'll comment occasionally on things in the newspaper. You'll see him sitting there drinking a cup of coffee and looking at the newspaper. Um, People have told me that I've made Snuffy maybe a little kinder and gentler toward uh, to people, but I don't know that that's necessarily true. But people have told me that.
Well,
But
and it also seems like you've utilized Barney a little bit more.
I do. I did. That's what I was going to say. I have brought in some characters that haven't appeared in the comic strip for quite a long time and reintroduced them to a new generation of people. The main characters, of course, are Barney and Sparkplug, but I've also brought in Snuffy Smith's father. He was out of the comic strip for quite a long, long time, and I reintroduced him, and I've brought back this kind of magical sort of witch lady, Granny Creeps, that
Hmm.
was in the comic strip, pretty popular back in the she was popular in the 70s. But the biggest change I think probably that I have made is bringing back Barney Google and Sparkplug almost to, I guess you'd say, semi-regular characters. And kind of the way that all happened was, I think I mentioned a little while ago that I do a lot of Snuffy Smith chalk talks where I go and speak to groups. And inevitably, whenever I would speak to groups, at the end, I always have a question and answer session. And somebody would always ask, whatever happened to Barney Google? I remember Barney Google. Of course, usually it was an older person that asked, but
Of
um,
course. Yeah.
So that was back in about, I think around 2012. I talked to my editors about it at King Features. At that time, my editor was Brendan Burford. And, I said, I get this question a lot. What would you think if we brought Barney Google and Sparkplug back for a special week? And he said, that's a great idea. Go for it. So I did. And the response was so great. People really seemed to love it. I really enjoyed doing it. It was a lot of fun to do. And so then after that, we began to bring him back every year for like 2 separate, like week-long visits.
Mm-hmm.
And then still the response was great. So now we usually do about 3 different weeks a year, maybe 4. But last year, with it being the 100th anniversary, in 2019, we brought him back a whole lot. I would say probably for at least 5 weeks, maybe over the time frame, because we had a special centennial celebration, birthday type celebration, and so I guess that would be a contribution that I have had to bring him back. It is kind of amazing. Like I had a little boy come. Let me think. He came to visit me last year, and he was probably about 10 or 11. It was at a Comic-Con here in Virginia, and asked me to, he asked me if I'd draw a character for him, and I said, yeah, who's your favorite character? And he said, Sparkplug. And I said, really? So I did, but I was just like, wow, he was at the most 12 years old, and I just thought that really surprised me. So that made me feel good that he knew the Barney Google and Snuffy Smith characters.
Well, I have to tell you, and you know this because we've talked about it before, but I love Barney. I love Barney Google, and I love Sparkplug. And I would just love to see you do a little story that sort of, like you did a wonderful story for the 100th anniversary. We'll talk about that in a second because I think you must have a lot of fun with that. But I would love, I'm just going to throw this out there. I would love for you to do a little story that, shows Sparkplug in his element a little bit. That would be, it would be a big change, but boy, I'd love to see that because I just love that character.
Right. Yeah, that would be fun. And, his birthday's coming up in a couple of years. He'll be 100, so maybe we'll have to do something fun for him.
Wouldn't that be great? I would love to see it. Yeah, that would be so much fun. Yeah, I love Sparkplug and I love Barney Google. I love that's one of the things I love about Billy DeBeck's stuff is that whole seedy world that Barney Google lived in.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a contrast from Appalachia and the world of the mountains, but still it was interesting in and of itself, as a world. And I think Billy DeBeck's style was perfectly suited to what he was doing back then,
And it's something about Barney Google with those. I just always thought he was such a wonderfully crafted character, like with those big round eyes, but his short stature and his, big feet. And I don't know. I just think he's a wonderfully designed character.
I agree with you totally.
He just kind of makes you smile when you look at him.
Yeah, and stuff he does too. But
right.
But because Barney is a rarity, you don't see him all that often. Just makes every time he shows up that much more special, and it just makes you wish that you could, like an old friend, you wish you could hang out with him a little bit longer. You know what I mean? So let's talk about that 100th anniversary. That's a series of strips you did. So tell the audience a little bit about what you did for Snuffy and Barney's 100th anniversary.
Well, again, from those chalk talks that I would do, a lot of times a question or somebody would just raise at the end. They'd say, the comic strip's going to be 100 in 5 years or 10 years. You got anything planned? And so I really started thinking about it, and I guess I had the idea about 2 years ahead of time. Or a year and a half ahead of time, maybe I started working on it. Barney Google and Snuffy Smith isn't the oldest comic strip in syndication. That honor belongs to Gasoline Alley, and Jim Scancarelli did an awesome job with doing a 100th anniversary story for them in late 2000. I guess that was late 2018. But Barney Google and Snuffy Smith is the oldest comic strip in syndication in King Features lineup. So I thought what I would do, I kind of came up with the idea of kind of doing a King Features salute to Barney Google and Sparkplug, but then also kind of a play on the fact that a lot of people say Barney Google doesn't come around that much. Whatever happened to Barney Google? Where is Barney Google? So the storyline essentially was that Barney Google decides he's going to come to Hootin Holler to visit Snuffy Smith for his birthday, but then on his way to go to Hootin Holler, he gets lost because he hadn't been there in quite a while. So by getting lost, Granny Creeps, the witch that I mentioned earlier, kind of switches some signs around, and Barney Google and Sparkplug end up in all kinds of other comic strips along the way. Like they end up in the Popeye comic strip, and they end up in Blondie and Mother Goose and Grimm, and just so many other comic strips. And eventually these other King Features characters, and I had a few that weren't King Features characters, but they point Barney in the right direction, and he finally gets to his birthday party just on time. I think it was about a 2.5 week long series, and it was probably such a joy. It was such a joy for me to create. It was, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had so much fun getting to do that. Actually, in one panel of a Sunday page, I paid a little bit of tribute to Charles Schultz in that. In addition to King Features characters, I did mention I paid tribute to Charles Schultz, and Garfield was in it.
Oh yes.
But for the most part, it was all King Features characters.
Well, yeah, and it's a wonderful array of characters. I mean, we have in one strip Mutz, and then Hagar the Horrible, and Garfield, and Zippy,
Right.
which was joy to see, and then Shoe, and who else? Dennis the Menace, and Curtis, and just the Tinkersons, and all kinds of characters in Popeye.
It was especially so neat because so many of these comics I've admired for years and years, and I've read for years and years, or even if it's a newer comic strip like the Tinkersons, I just think it's a great strip. So it was fun to get to include these characters.
Oh yeah.
And then some of the characters in turn, some other strips, for example, like Mutz paid tribute to Barney Google turning 100. Shoe did as well on the 100th birthday on that day. There was quite a few others. Dennis the Menace did. So that was really rewarding too, to see Barney Google all over the comic pages that day.
It was great. So what was the response like from the fans?
It was incredible. When I think back on it, that I did a special Sunday page, and then the actual birthday was on Monday, and the story continued, I think, through Wednesday after the birthday. But especially on that Monday, I remember coming down, and the amount of emails and messages and different things that I got. I pretty much started about 8 o'clock in the morning, and I didn't really get up from the computer until about 11 o'clock at night. It was just so many messages that I had, and emails, and it was kind of like that for about 2 days. And I had done a lot of things before that for it, and a lot after. So it was really incredible. Probably one of the best experiences of my cartooning career, and I was just honored to get to be a part of it.
Oh, absolutely. It's a thrill to be part of something that special, and really kind of neat the way the fans and the media responded. Showing a kind of love for the characters and for the world of Snuffy Smith and Barney Google that you don't see an awful lot of. I mean, people don't talk a lot about it because, I mean, like a lot of comic strips that have been around for a long time, folks just sort of take them for granted in a way. And so it's nice to see that kind of appreciation coming your way and your way, and also a tribute to both Billy DeBeck and Fred Laswell as well.
True. That was one thing I really wanted to make sure that I pointed out in the Sunday page. I did have Barney Google and Snuffy Smith in the top two panels actually like taking their hats off in respect to Billy DeBeck and Fred Laswell. I kind of copied their signatures and then had each character, tip their hat to Fred and Billy. And so I really wanted to make sure to show that, it was definitely quite a team effort. So.
And you what you did was you adapted or adopted rather both of their styles.
I tried my best. Yeah,
Yeah,
I tried my best.
and the variation there is pretty clear. It's pretty cool. Nice kind of thing to see. So, I mean, that's great, and I think it's just an exciting moment in the history of the strip, and nice to be part of. And hey, I mean, we think about it, it's really quite remarkable. There's you
right.
and Gasoline Alley, and really not much else from those days. From the earliest days of the newspaper comic strip. And, Billy DeBeck was kind of like one of that era's, real cartoonists from the early days of the newspaper and the beginnings of syndication. I mean, he was one of those guys who, like Tad and Harriman and LZ Segar and all of those guys, he was in that group of originators, and that's kind of
right. And they were like giant celebrities in their time.
Yep. And it's pretty amazing, to think about the history and the longevity. So, I mean, that's great. So, do you still get fan mail? Do you get people writing you and reaching out to you about the characters? Or
I do. I get letters. I get emails. And one thing that's kind of neat. I guess when I started years ago, and I do get a lot of letters from older people, and I just kind of thought that would always be my main fan base. But then I've come to notice over time, just like I mentioned about that young boy saying Sparkplug was his favorite character. When I do like personal appearances and different things, kids will come up to me and tell me how much they love Tater or they love Jughead. And a few years ago, let me think. No, actually, I guess this would have been 2 years ago. A young boy who was in fourth grade, his parents contacted me and let me know that in his school they had the library in the school had a contest around Halloween that was pumpkin themed, and it was create your favorite book character out of pumpkins. And they would have a contest, and the winner would get a prize. And he came to know the Snuffy Smith character through my book collections instead of through the newspaper. So this is a young kid, like fourth grade, and he made an incredible design. They sent me pictures of it, of Snuffy Smith fishing out of gourds and pumpkins that he painted, and it was incredible. So just to know too that you've introduced young people to these characters, and they've come to like them too, and they want to get in touch with you too, and that's very rewarding.
yeah, I mean, it's really kind of remarkable to hear that the characters still resonate with young people, and with kids who are getting into comics maybe for the first time, or come across a Snuffy Smith collection in their library or something. It's they're. I mean, one of the things about the comic is that it's an all ages comic, and really doesn't matter what age you are.
Right.
You come to the comic and get into it, whether you're just learning to read, and because most of the time it doesn't have an overabundance of language, and or whether you're somebody who's older who's read the strip for years. It appeals to both, and that's a very difficult thing to do, to be able to walk that tightrope and reach into both audiences. But you do that very well.
Oh, well, thank you. It's funny you mentioned about the writing. I have people have asked me, the characters talk in a very strong rural dialect, and people say, is it hard to write in that dialect? And my answer always is, it's not hard to write in it, but once you've been writing and working in it all day long, it's hard at the end of the day to answer an email or a letter seriously. Like, you don't want to reply back, thank you for the email, youngin, or, or something like that. you know.
I can see how that could be a problem. So, when you work with these characters, have you ever found anything that about a character that surprised you or intrigued you, or that you find some characters easier to write for than other characters?
Definitely, my favorite character to write for is Snuffy, but over time, I've really come to enjoy Tater and Jughead a lot. I can have a lot of fun with Tater, and he's a very simple character, but Jughead really reminds me a lot of myself and my brothers when we were younger, and we lived at that point in the mountains of Virginia, and my parents had a farm, and I remember playing in the creek and fishing, and a lot of Jughead reminds me of myself and my brothers. That's something I've discovered over the length of time. In, I think, what year was that? In 2015 or 16. Well, for years, Snuffy Smith had his own comic book with Charlton Comics.
Oh,
I think
yes.
with Gold Key Comics and
Sure.
maybe one or two others. But there was I guess you'd say, a tribute type comic publication called Charlton Spotlight or they feature new comics featuring old Charlton characters. And they got in touch with me and with King Features. And I did a 10-page story. I think it was called Hop Along Jughead. And it was a story all about Jughead and a frog jumping contest. And that was so much fun, just to kind of step out of the 2 panels or 3 panels that I have to work in every day and tell like a 10-page story with him. Snuffy was in it, but he was more of a minor character. It was mainly all about Jughead, and that was really fun for me to get to do.
And what was that published in?
It's a magazine. It was Charlton Spotlight number 9. Was
Wow.
the number 9 was the number of the publication.
I know the name Charlton Spotlight, but that's a current magazine? I'm kind of you're catching me off guard here with that one, because Charlton
it was just a few years ago, so I know they're working on another one if they haven't had another one come out. But yeah, you can still see it online, Charlton Spotlight.
Because Charlton went out of business a long time ago, as far as I understand.
Right.
So
I guess it's kind of I don't know how they used that name. There's a couple other groups that Charlton Neo, I think, is another one.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm not sure how they got to use that name, but you're right. It's not the original Charlton, like Charlton
okay.
But they pay tribute to and write stories about
okay.
Charlton Comics, older Charlton Comics, and then cartoonists that drew for Charlton.
Oh, sure, of course. Yeah, and it's sort of like one of those Tomorrow's publications about comics history and
right.
alter ego and things like that. But it focuses specifically on Charlton. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've never picked one of those up, but I have heard about it, because I do love those kinds of magazines, and boy, that would be a treat. So that was in issue number 9, huh?
Yeah, I'll send you a copy. I'll be happy to send you a copy.
All right. I
have a few.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool thing. I mean, I think we all grew up with Charlton Comics pretty much all over the place. At least I don't know what their distribution was like, but I lived in the Northeast, so Charlton was almost easier to find sometimes than Marvel and DC. So, they'd be sold, and Gold Key Comics were very popular when I was a kid.
Right.
I
remember. I love comic books as a kid, and even now. But even when I was a kid, my favorite ones were like comic books about my favorite Saturday morning cartoon at the time, or Yogi's Laugh Olympics, or Scooby Doo, or the Flintstones. When they, I would love things like that. And that was a neat thing about my grandmother's house. I mentioned my grandmother earlier, but when I was young, I remember her house in this small town. We spent a lot of weekends there, and I remember reading the comics and, like I said, in her paper. But her house was like one block from the corner newsstand where you could walk and just get anything off the spinner racks, any of your favorite comic books, or
Mhm.
then 2 blocks the other way from the local library, and where I could just check out any kind of book on how to draw cartoons that I wanted to do. So it was like it's like the perfect location for a budding cartoonist.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I have those kind of. It's interesting when you think about it. Those kinds of memories of how they're the ways in the that you interact or find comics or gravitate to them. I have similar kinds of memories myself. My grandmother lived in the city of Binghamton. We lived outside of it, but we'd go visit her, and a lot of times there wasn't. She lived in an apartment, so there wasn't a lot for me to do. So she'd give me like a quarter, and I'd go out and walk around the streets, and there was a corner store, and in the corner store this guy had a few comics. Now, he didn't have a spinner rack, but what he did have, he had Charlton comics, and he had the gold key packages of 3 comics for whatever it was.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
I love those. Those are among still my favorite comics ever. There'd be a Flash Gordon comic and a Phantom comic, and maybe there would be a Beetle Bailey comic or something else in there, that was like that. And I loved those. Those were great. Those packages. Nice to
Hmm.
get three comics for, in those days it wasn't a lot of money. I guess it was maybe 25 cents. I don't remember. But
I
anyway,
think you're right. Yeah.
having access to those, having access to comics in general was so important if you were of the mind to become a cartoonist,
Right.
and today I think it's different. You got to go to the comic shop in order to pick up comics. It's different when you just walk into a store and there they are, and you have immediate access to them. I think we were lucky in that
Yeah,
way. Of
they were,
course,
newsstands, just, drugstores or grocery stores. Yeah, they were just all over.
all over the place, yeah. I mean, of course, now kids go online and they're all there at the fingertips, um, but there was something neat about going out on your own with a quarter in your hand and buying comic books and bringing them home. Such an informative memory of those. So,
Hmm.
so Barney Google showed up again this year. You just finished a story arc with Barney. Uh,
Right.
is he coming back again before the year
I
is over with?
he will. He'll be back. I have one story um, written. I have another one that I'm working on for later. So he'll be back. Yeah, he'll definitely be back this year.
He'll be
So
back a couple of times, it sounds like.
hmm
That's
so
pretty.
far, at least a couple weeks, couple more
That,
weeks I know of.
that's good news for Barney Google fans, right?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that Barney's going to
It's
show.
it's a lot of fun. I enjoy that, getting to bring him back.
Oh yeah, well and it's special,
Hmm.
it's always very special. And this week, I think Loweezy was trying to get him married. If I,
Right,
it
right.
was a pretty
Louisiana
good
and Elvini, yeah, they were trying to play matchmaker.
matchmaker with him. Yep, and he escaped, narrow escape.
Right.
From that. So that's pretty cool. Yeah. And so how does the future look for Snuffy Smith and for Barney Google? I mean, in these days of dwindling newspapers and I mean, how do things look for the foreseeable future for Snuffy?
I mean, I hope Snuffy and comics in general will always be around. I mean, I know I'm a huge fan of so many comics, and I know probably most people probably aren't as big a fan as I am, but um, I really feel like comics and Snuffy Smith. I hope they'll be around for many more years to come. Just maybe on different platforms, and hopefully they'll be on whatever platform we're on right now.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I know, or whatever platform we're on at the time. I know, I used to always read the comics in the paper, and I still do look at my local paper for the comics, but then I also go online now and find so many other comics, and you have it on your phone, and um, so many comic sites out there. So I sure hope um, that they'll be around, and it's encouraging to see all the different book collections and the graphic novels that are coming out for young kids that feature comics. And I sure hope they'll be around on whatever platform we have, and I hope Snuffy will be there.
Well, one of the things that I find it I think interesting, I've seen on my Instagram feed recently, is that King is now looking like there's a new comic coming out called hashtag sales, I think is the comic, and they're promoting it pretty heavily on Instagram. And I noticed that one of the things they say about that comic is, it's not only comic strips, but it's memes and cartoons and, maybe a little bit of animation here and there. And so it struck me as kind of interesting that now they're sort of expanding what the idea, or at least what King Features has traditionally promoted as a comic strip, is now a multimedia vehicle in a way. I mean, it's appearing in different forms, different formats, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it signals a different strategy as far as moving forward with comics. Maybe we'll see stuff like that happening with Snuffy Smith eventually.
Yeah, that'd be cool. I have seen that in the last couple of weeks. I don't know anything about it other than that I know it's created by the gentleman that creates the Tinkerson's comic strip, but
Right.
It'll be interesting to see what that is.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, and because I think it signals, I think, a welcome and interesting change to, one of the most venerated syndicates and their approach, this sort of realization that we're in a different time, a different world, and both bringing forward the old world and then adapting to the new world. And I think that's kind of interesting, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes.
I agree. They really seem to have their their pulse on their hand on the pulse of what's going on out there technologically and in newsprint and all different avenues. So
I'm kind of excited to see.
It is exciting. Yeah, it's an exciting time, and they're on top of it, which is pretty neat.
Yeah, it's great, and I hope they have great success with it. So, well, anyway, this has been great having this conversation, John. I've really enjoyed talking to you for the last hour and a half or so, and it's gone by real quick. And
I've enjoyed it a lot. I appreciate you inviting me to do this. It's been a lot of fun.
You are, like both Ron Ferdinand and Marcus Hamilton, who I talked to over the last couple of weeks. You are far too humble.
I don't know. They're great guys. Golly, they do amazing work, and they're even better folks. Even they're great folks too.
They are great folks, and it's wonderful. But it's I think one of the things that it's easy to take for granted is the idea that once a strip is established, somebody can come along and take it and continue that success unabated, and it's a real challenge, and it's not an easy thing to do, because you have an audience that already exists that wants what they want, and what they want is what Hank Ketchum did, or they want what Fred Laswell did, or whatever, and then you pick it up. You're a new person, you bring your own ideas and thoughts to it, and you have to find a way to do that, at the same time continue it forward in a way that the old audience finds acceptable. And that's not an easy task. And I think all three of you gentlemen have done an admirable job of bringing your strips forward and maintaining their health and vitality. And I tip my hat to all of you, because I think it's a very difficult thing to do. And
thank you very much. I guess I really feel like probably the secret, and not the secret, but I guess the key ingredient in that is that maybe Ron and Marcus and I were all trained so well by such great cartoonists in Fred Laswell and Hank Ketchum, and I guess maybe that's helped us a little bit, and we're trying our best to stay true to what we were taught, and then expand on it a little bit too.
Yep, and certainly one of the things that you've done in bringing Barney Google and Sparkplug back, I think that's the hallmark, a big hallmark of what you've brought to the strip.
Well, thank
And
you. That makes me feel really good. I really appreciate you saying that.
well, absolutely, and I think the sequence of strips that you did for the 100th anniversary, those are going to be remembered for a long time, and I
Well,
think that was a
thank you.
pretty unique gift that you brought to the strip and to comics in general. So it's great, and I wish you continued success with Snuffy, and I'll keep reading and looking for Barney and Sparkplug, and maybe one of those days we'll see that Sparkplug story.
Yeah. I think that'd be fun to do. I mean, I really like to thank you for having me on your podcast. I'd like to just say too, I'm so thankful to Fred Laswell and King Features for the wonderful opportunity they gave me, and then of course to Billy DeBeck for getting the whole
Yeah.
ball rolling. So
Yep. It's great to remember our forebears in comics
right,
and pay tribute to them too,
yeah.
because those contributions and those strips are still there for us to go back and look at and marvel at, because a lot of them are
Hmm.
just so great. And IDW, right? Is it IDW that's doing the Barney Google
Yes,
reprints?
yes.
Yeah,
They did the Barney Google for President.
yeah,
It came out on the last day of 2019. It was part of the 100th anniversary celebration, but it's they're part of their Essential series, the Library of American Comics Essential series, and it's a beautiful book.
yeah.
I was honored to get to write a forward for it, but the book as a whole, it's just really neat to see Billy DeBeck's style and the character of Barney Google and Sparkplug
Yeah, it's
and
just
some of
lovely.
their early, uh, really popular stories.
Well, we live in a moment, where we're so fortunate that all of these wonderful collections are coming out to preserve the legacy of comic strips, and I just love it. I'm building up this. My wife says I don't know what we're gonna do with all these books, because I have.
My wife says the same thing.
I'm not getting any younger, but I figure one of these days I'm just gonna, I'd like to make sure all of the stuff goes to a library or something that really wherein young cartoonists can interact with it somehow anyway. But because it's just so wonderful, and they're doing such a great job, and it's so great to see Billy DeBeck's work in a way brought to a new audience, and because I think once people pick it up, they just realize that the vitality that is in those original strips never dies. It's still there, and
Hmm.
vitality in his cartooning is still there. So that's something I think that any generation can respond to, and so it's great to see. Well,
Yeah.
John, thank you very much.
Well,
And
thank you. Actually, before you go, I just want to tell you too. I've really enjoyed since we become friends on Instagram. I've seen some of your animations,
oh,
and especially your that stay at home animation, the squash and stretch of the
oh yeah,
house.
yeah.
That was cool. That was really neat.
Well, thank you very much. I'm kind of like a failed comic strip artist who's resuscitated as an animator in a way. I
I
mean,
think animation's fascinating. I wish I knew more about it. I've always enjoyed it, from the Saturday morning cartoons to the Walt Disney films to
oh,
everything.
me
So,
too. And I'm very fortunate, that I have a job wherein I can share that with students, and at the same time, I'm sort of paid to continue my own research into it. And and I realized that comics, cartoons, it's all part of the same thing for me, as long as it's, we're dealing with that world, and whether it's animation or comic strips or comic books, it's all, for me, it's all part of the same meal, it's all part of the same
hmm,
world. And I
right.
love dealing with all of it, and working with all of it. The thing about animation is it does take forever, to do,
Right.
but it is like it's like a roller coaster ride. Once you get on, you can't get off. And
Right.
so, yeah.
That's a good
So,
description.
and so I'm working on two films right now. One's a longer project, and working with older characters and somebody else's material, and then the other one is my own. And who knows? We'll see. But I'm having a great time with them, and along the way, I do little things like that public service announcement that I did
Hmm.
about
Well, that's
COVID.
exciting. That's neat. I look forward
Yeah,
to seeing them.
Well, thank you, and I'll keep posting them. And
Sure.
and I love seeing what you're doing on Instagram also, and it's a great place to meet up and keep tabs on what people in this wonderful field of ours are doing. So
Hmm.
it's great.
I
So
agree.
John, it'll be great to have you on again sometime in the future. I'm gonna hit the stop recording button now.
Okay.
And then we can say our own personal farewells. But for now,
All
for
right.
the show anyway, thank you, John Rose, for being here on Blockhead. And we'll catch up with you again and with Barney Google in the funny pages.
Well, thank you.
So there we are. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with John Rose as much as I did. It was really great to sit down with John and talk Barney Google and Snuffy Smith, to talk about Fred Laswell, and really what an interesting individual he was. And he brought a lot to the table. Not only was he a great cartoonist, but he was also an inventor and invented a whole pile of different things. If you check him out on Wikipedia, like I just did, you'll find out a whole pile of stuff that he invented and got involved with, well beyond the realm of comics too. So pretty interesting individual. It's really kind of neat, we get this image of a cartoonist as being just that. That's his public image for us cartooning fans. But there's so much more, and there certainly is about Fred Laswell and John Rose as well, and it was great to talk to John. John has a number of Snuffy Smith collections out there, and you should really avail yourself of them. Check them out on Amazon or elsewhere. I happen to have Snuffy Smith in his Sunday Best here with me, a treasury of Snuffy Smith Sunday comics by John, and it's a wonderful book collecting some recent Snuffy Smith cartoons by John Rose. And I have to tell you, I shared it with one or two of my students just to talk about how to use black and white to create a dynamic page. When you're keeping it very simple and utilizing just clean line, how do you create a page that still pops? And John Rose does it all the way through this book, which is in black and white, but it's beautiful. It really is. And the use of black and white here, it's just a textbook lesson for students who want to create a simple comic, but they want that page to sing. And Snuffy Smith really does that. And kudos to John for that. So check those books out on Amazon. Snuffy Smith and his Sunday Best, and there are a couple of others collecting John's work. You'll really enjoy them. As promised, John did send me the Charlton Spotlight. Number 9 is the issue, as he said in the interview. And it does include this wonderful story starring Jughead from Snuffy Smith. And it's a terrific story about a frog race, really hilarious, and it really does allow John to stretch his cartooning talents a little bit. So you can see he had a lot of fun with it, and it's a lot of fun to read. So you might look for that also if you are in the mood for some Snuffy Smith and you want some more than you usually get in your Sunday Comics page. You got a couple of choices there. So check them out. That'll do it for me. Be sure to follow me on Instagram at GroganJeff, GroganGeoff. You can check me out on my own website, jeffgrogan.com. And hey, don't forget about my Patreon page. For those of you who are inclined or of the means to support this podcast, any amount you can pledge would be greatly appreciated. We have some great stuff coming up for you. Kevin Much of The Rough Pearl from Fantagraphics is up next. We have Brian Walker from Beetle Bailey. Yes, the great comics historian and comics writer, cartoonist, Brian Walker of Beetle Bailey and High and Lois. And boy, oh boy, that's a great interview covering lots of ground. So that's coming up. Be sure to look forward to that. And then we have Khalid Birdsong. We heard Khalid in conversation with Ray Billingsley. Now we're going to have Khalid on his own, flying solo, as it were. So lots to look forward to this summer. That'll do it for now. It's me in my closet saying be well, be safe, wear your mask, practice social distancing because this COVID thing isn't going away anytime soon. And so long, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.